It is really hard to make a teaser video after Matt Braun has made a teaser video. So, first of all, so thank you, Gene. And not just for the introduction, which still makes me really uncomfortable, but for everything you're doing.
Because I did it?
Usually when you speak, I become uncomfortable immediately. But no, for everything you're doing here, right? This is, I've been in Toledo for 3.5 years. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like 3 months and or 30 years, but definitely nothing in between, right? And this is what community feels like, right? It's starting to build, and the fact that you can have these announcements at the beginning where people are synchronizing efforts and there are centralized repositories of information, right? This is it. This is momentum. It's not escape velocity, right? But it's momentum. I'm very privileged to have so many people come here on a really terrible night. I do think I set the record for youngest attendees. Thank you, Lucas family. And I also just want to underscore quickly how grateful you should be to the museum staff. Because what you all don't know is that well, maybe some of you do, is our pop-up cafe, or as I've been joking, our slowly deflating cafe, which is three weeks behind schedule, is still closed. And they catered a lunch today for 60 people with no kitchen, right? And they still put this on. So, like, give it up one more time for our staff. An amazing job. So I agreed to do this talk on the condition that I could drink a beer as I did it. So I'm going to do that. Thank you all for coming. Some of you may know that I speak a lot. This is like a shake hands, kiss babies job for sure. So I spend a lot of time talking to cameras and to people. I don't frequently get an opportunity to talk about something I haven't spoken about before. Usually it's about visual literacy or the museum's strategic plan. Or I did get to give a talk at the Association for Advertising Foundation, AF, I forget what it's called, the Creativity Summit, about innovation at the museum. There will only be 2 partial slides that are repeated from that. So this is a brand new talk. This means 2 things. It means this is great for me. It also means please bear with me. I don't know what the next slide is. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the Entrepreneurial Museum, which is not just something I've made up for the purposes of fitting what we're doing in here into Startup Toledo. It's actually an ethos that we have here. In spite of this long preface, I'm going to keep this to 30 minutes. If we have questions afterwards, we'll open it up to the floor. If you're really asking questions after 10 or 15 minutes, then I'll just hang around and we'll break out and we can all get more drinks and food. At any time, feel free to get drinks or food. But I hope to do 2 things on this talk. I hope to give you a very high-level overview of the way we think about entrepreneurship and the way, hopefully, it contributes to this community, not just to what we do at the museum. I also, and some of you who have gotten to know me over the time I've been here, know I try to be very precise in my language. And I think that one of the greatest faults with discussions of entrepreneurship is how sloppy we are with what it actually means. So I hope to actually, even though it's not my primary objective, dispel some of the mythology around what it means to be an entrepreneur. Because I would imagine, and this will be my teaser for you, that most people think it means to start a company, and it doesn't. Even though that might be the textbook definition, and we'll explore why in just a second. So if I'm telling you that there is such a thing as an entrepreneurial museum, and I'm even going to be so bold as to claim at the outset that we are one, and there are a vast majority that are not, apologies if I cover the mic and it gets messed up for you, Andrew, what does that mean, right? Why would a museum want to be entrepreneurial? Especially this one, right? Because this is what you think of, right? I mean, this is a more dynamic shot, which makes the Calder look like it's in much more appropriate proportion to the building than it actually is. But you know, some of us are historians and pay attention to those things. But you think about the classical facade, and you think about an institution that builds itself to be like a Roman temple, right? We want to be here forever. our investment policy time horizon is infinity. That's like not a joke. It says in our investment policy that our time horizon is infinity, right? It's an infinite time horizon. So that's not exactly what you would call like a propensity for risk taking. You're about being here, right? That's what you think of us as. You think of us as 36 acres, 6 buildings, maybe more. One of the best art collections in America. For those of you who don't know, we have what I would call one of the 5 best art collections in North America, work for work. It's extraordinary quality. And what a lot of people don't know, which further would lead you to suggest that we shouldn't be risk-taking, is that we are 100% private. So we're free every day. Many of you know that. A lot of you probably think that we're levy funded, and there are lots of institutions, great ones that are. We get 0.5% of our operating budget from a grant from the Ohio Arts Council that they could say no to. Every single dollar that we have is privately raised. Now you might say, oh, but the Libby's left you so much money. Well, 80% of our endowment is post-Libby. So we are free every day and private because people in the community have supported us. Entrepreneurship doesn't just mean earning income, right? It means delivering on social value and finding entrepreneurial ways to do that. So while you may think of us as this state organization that is very stable and risk averse, we're not, right? What we're actually about is this. And you can read that image in lots of different ways. But the most important stat is that 95% of our visitors come with another person. The museum is a social experience. It's a place you come to enjoy great art, to go to a program, to go to a lecture in the green room. How did we come up with the name? I don't know. But you come with someone else. By show of hands, how many people came here alone? And by show of hands, how many people came here alone thinking that they didn't know anyone here? Good for you. There we go, 95%, plus or minus, right? This is how it works. We want to spend the time, and this is why I'm keeping it to 30 minutes, because we all want to go home. It's the end of the day, right? We want to spend the time that we have, right, that we've bought with our labor, doing fun things. So what's the museum marketplace? What are we actually doing? What are we competing in? Well, we compete in 2 different markets, at least as far as I'm concerned. We compete in the market for leisure time, right? I think that's, a lot of people would agree with that one. But I think there's, and notice the precise language difference in prepositions there. We also compete in the market of memory making. There are lots of different ways you can compete in the market for leisure time, but the reason people come to a museum, especially with someone else, is to have an experience that becomes part of their memory. There are lots of things you do every day that you don't remember 5 minutes later. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, right? I think that's because I didn't have breakfast this morning. But right, this is how it works. Generally speaking, you're only seeing about 10% of what you think you're seeing. So 90% of your experience is just going in one eye and out the other, so to speak, right? This is what we do. We have people come when they're not working and have experiences that are memorable. So if that's our market, then we need to create products that deliver on those things, and we need to make sure that we're staffed with people who can do those things. That's a business challenge. That's a challenge of entrepreneurship. And here is a really important point. This is why being an entrepreneur is not about starting a company. Because by show of hands, who in here has started a company? It's a lot of people. Now by show of hands, how many people have started a company by simply replicating an existing product? That's very honest. Give them a round of applause. That is not an easy thing to do. Generally speaking, the thing that makes the company is the product. Being an entrepreneur isn't about building a company. It's about building the product that people want to consume and putting it into a corporate shell. Just because our corporate shell already exists doesn't mean that we're not entrepreneurial. It doesn't mean we don't have an imperative to be entrepreneurial, particularly since expectations around leisure time are vastly changing. We have less and less of it, or at least we feel like we have less and less of it, which means there's even more of an imperative to have great memory making activities. So if we need to be entrepreneurial, what is, right, an entrepreneurial museum? Well, fortunately, not every answer needs to have like this very profound, right, response. It's a museum full of entrepreneurs. That's what it is. Well, and this is another really important point, I think, at least. Beer time. Hold on. There we go. Absolutely. There is no such thing as culture. So you heard I studied anthropology. Culture is not like a thing, right? It's like great when a CEO comes in, he's like, I'm going to change the culture, right? Or like when a CFO comes in and she says, I'm going to change the culture. Like, that doesn't happen, right? Culture is an emergent phenomenon. Culture emerges out of behaviors, and behaviors are a function of people. So to say that you want to have an entrepreneurial museum is great. How many times have you had someone, maybe a boss in a past life, right? Or a company that you follow say, I'm going to create a more entrepreneurial environment. And they don't change who's on the bus or the seats they're sitting on in the bus, right? That ain't how it works, right? Culture is about people, what they do, and the actions that they undertake. And the compilation, the sum of all of those actions is what culture is. It's actually the sum of the interactions of all of those, right? People doing their things. So if we want to have an entrepreneurial museum, like make no mistake about it, it's not just saying we want to be entrepreneurs, it's getting entrepreneurs on your staff. So there are two ways of doing that, right? There are two ways of getting entrepreneurs. One is hiring people who already have that entrepreneurial spirit. So it's at this point, right, that, again, for those of you who know me, I'm shockingly good at not talking about myself. So I'm going to spend sort of 5 minutes talking about my trajectory and why entrepreneurship is really important to me, and some of the lessons I've learned. And some of them will be trite, but I hope some of them aren't, and explain why I think museums are really interesting loci for entrepreneurship. I have a background in finance. I spent some time at Citigroup in the energy investment banking world, which some of you may cause, which may cause some of you to think I'm like terribly evil, but we can have that conversation sidebar, because it was fascinating. And I knew it wasn't for me. Obviously, I elected to go another route, specifically to get a doctorate in art history, as most investment bankers do, right? But the thing that Citigroup was really good at, and this is why you should never poo-poo someone's experiences, because it turned me on to a way of thinking, which was entirely different. The thing that Citigroup is really good at is a part of the market called midstream, right? Midstream assets, basically transportation of oil, right? Or oil and natural gas. So upstream, right, is exploration and production. Downstream is getting it right from the pump. And then there's like, well, like what's the processing? Well, that's kind of E&P, upstream. And how does it get there? That's what Citigroup was great at. And by show of hands, how many of you have heard of REITs, real estate investment trusts? By show of hands, how many of you have heard of master limited partnerships? Good. Well, pretty good. So 10 years ago, it wasn't as many. Master limited partnerships are a structure that are basically like REITs of the energy market, right? They're a way to spread risk, but to basically pay very large dividends in a tax-advantaged way to people who help ship midstream assets. Who really cares, right? Well, here's why it's interesting. Because it's about structuring products, right? I was at Citigroup at a time where they were figuring out ways to create particular products that people would want to buy for a risk-adjusted return that was favorable to them. So I started thinking about real assets, pipelines, in ways that could be monetized, sometimes using cash flow, well, always using cash flows in that instance, but thinking about structuring new products for the marketplace. That was really interesting to me. There were other things that I learned there, some of which I didn't like, but that was a lesson to take away with me. And you heard from Gian that I spent a bit of time at Sotheby's in various roles on the art side of the business, in antiquities, so classical antiquities, so Greek, Roman, and what they called Western Asiatic, but basically Near Eastern art, pre-Columbian art, African and Oceanic art, but I also spent time on the business side in a group called the Business Intelligence Group, which unfortunately or fortunately for me, depending on how you look at it, when you double-clicked on my name in Outlook, I was the only person in that department. So, And I got to work on like some really fun projects, some of which, right, seem really obvious, but were really interesting. So for example, there were 4 different types of auctions. The auctions you're most familiar with that Sotheby's undertakes are called English auctions or ascending auctions, where people bid up the price, right? But if we're bidding on an object, say Andrew's camera, which I don't want to guess how much it costs, and I bid $5,000 and get the camera, I couldn't possibly have done that on my own because I would have happily paid $4,500 for it, right? The reason it got to $5,000 was because there was an underbidder. And the reason it got to $4,500 was because there might have been another underbidder. So one of my projects was apportioning value out to all of the people who bid, because Sotheby's gives everyone a paddle, so they know exactly who bids at what bid level. So thinking about deconstructing price, right, and thinking about deconstructing price in the art market allowed me to see that there were some similarities between structured products in other worlds and the real asset of art in another. So I didn't know where I was going, right? I was just trying things out. But by virtue of just doing things randomly, right? And this is actually my great fear for the educational system, right? That everyone wants to just like study their one thing, and they feel like if they just study business, they'll know business, right? It's actually about like this random association of things with each other that Art Research Technologies was born. So Art Research Technologies was my baby. It still is my baby in a certain way. Art Research Technologies valued art and valued options around art. There is an option market for art more accurately than anyone has to date. And it was a total synthesis of these 2 ideas. And we built the company. We built it out to, at one point, 6 full-time employees with office space in Dogpatch Labs, which is for Polaris Venture Partners space in Union Square in New York. I was in graduate school. I was commuting back and forth every month. We were cash flow positive. We had white label content in everything from the Wall Street Journal to Sotheby's trade publication. We were doing bespoke reports and analyses, but we were trying to build 2 different business models. And I was a shitty CEO. I was like, didn't know how to manage at all. We did okay, right? But we did okay in spite of myself. So you can say, and this is trite lesson number 1, I failed. Fortunately, there was some intellectual property there that has some value still, and we are in the process of selling it. And we should be getting a firm closing date from the chairman of the insurance company that's going to be buying it tomorrow. So that's good news. But it could have been much different and much better, you could argue. But it taught me how to manage. And it also sent me back on this, didn't send me back on this path that makes it sound like I'd never wanted to be in museums and I ended up in museums. I actually, part of the reason the company didn't end up succeeding is because I left to take a job in New York at the Met. Museums are the thing I always wanted to do. But I definitely learned a lot. So failure is important. Failure is really important. The thing they don't tell you, though, in school is that not all failure is equal. Right? This mythology around failure, the cult of failure, is actually a total lie, because there are different types. Failure of ideas is really dangerous, right? Because being an entrepreneur is cool. If you have a bad idea and you sink resources into it, then you're not an entrepreneur worth investing in, right? And I feel like that's something that gets lost in the shuffle here, right? You should be able to diagnose a good idea or a bad idea. That's a filter. If we want to be a museum of entrepreneurs, it means we need to hire good entrepreneurs. So I don't want people who've sunk their resources into an idea that's not worth pursuing. But you can also fail in execution. And there's this, like a bifurcated path there. Some people fail in execution and learn the lesson. I like to think that I'm closer to that than the other. If you can metabolize failure, if you can learn from it, if you can be better the next time, then failure is a really good thing. But if you don't learn the lesson, then what good is failure, except for the fact that we now have a cult around it and you can say, I failed, right? But like, okay, that might get you your next seed round, right? But it's never going to get you to A, right? So failure isn't this homogeneous entity, right? That's all good. There are different types of failure, and it's really important to acknowledge that. But the other thing I realized was that a lot of good ideas fail, and this was less about Art Research Technologies than it was about being in that space, Dogpatch Labs. sort of an incubator slash shared workspace, but a lot of those companies were pretty significantly funded. What you realize is that capital really means a lot, right? And you all know that, right? But it gets understated because we tend to believe that the best idea is right. But this is something museums can teach startups, right? Because museums and universities, or even better, are really good at fundraising. And raising money is about asking people for the right amount, the right person for the right amount, and the right circumstance at the right time. And ideas are exactly the same way, right? An idea can flounder because it's too early or because it's too late. It can be the best idea in the world at exactly the right time, but you can't have the network to get capital. And that is an area that Toledo remains a bit challenged, access to capital. But it made me realize, like, where can you find buckets of capital to do really interesting things? Well, one of the places that I think a lot of you are probably following are foundations. Foundations can't spend enough money, so they've devised this legal program-related investment item to create some investment. But museums, really great museums, right, tend to have large endowments. And they all invest them in the market, and they take on risk in the market. And sometimes, right, the biggest ones are able to access really good investment opportunities, high-yielding private equity funds or hedge funds, where they take on liquidity risk. Well, like, why can't that liquidity risk be spread into venture investments closer to home? So it caused me, although we're not there yet, the museum has made one venture investment, and we're not there culturally yet, it caused me to think of the museum as an entrepreneurial locus. And that, I think, was sort of a big pivot for me. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a museum that has a board that lets us explore these opportunities, and have a director that allows us to explore these opportunities. So we spend a lot of time thinking about hiring the right people to create a culture of product development for leisure time and memory making. That's called museum entrepreneurship. So the other way to do this, right, isn't just to hire entrepreneurs, right? Because sometimes, particularly in the museum field, where we don't necessarily have channels to the types of people who are interested in this type of activity, it's incumbent on us to make entrepreneurs, to take people who have that raw talent, who have that raw predisposition, and to try and turn them into people who can think in the type of ways that I've just described. And there are some companies in here, right, some people who represent companies in here that are doing a really admirable job of that. The person who comes to mind in particular is Josh Cooper and White Label, for making entrepreneurs, for hiring people who don't necessarily even know how to develop software, develop code, and teaching them how to. And the guy right there in the hat is the guy teaching them, Scott. So give them some love too. So how do you make an entrepreneur? Well, like, fortunately, this is where the museum's really interesting, because like, if you hear about incubators and accelerators one more time, you're probably going to shoot yourself in the head, right? We are a big institution that has access to big institutional resources, and we have a very particular way of doing things. But we hope that we've chosen tools that allow us to bring people into the organization that are cultural fits, that are predisposed to entrepreneurship, and give them the opportunity to think about ways that they can develop new products and give them the tools and the teams to do so. So a brief note about two tools that we use. Beer. Three tools. Beer. So the first tool is something called the Competing Values Framework, which you can see pictured. The Competing Values Framework comes out of the University of Michigan. There's an innovation consulting shop there run by a guy named Jeff DeGraff, called the Innovatrium. The name is almost as inventive as the Green Room. And they have identified, and this is a really important point, 4 different ways that you can innovate. Another failure of the discourse around entrepreneurship is everyone thinks that an entrepreneur needs to be like Steve Jobs and have brand new ideas that no one has ever had before. You can be a control, right? This is where you want your like CFO to be, right? Not to take a lot of risks, but to innovate at the margin. Process improvements. Improvements can very well be innovations. Someone who competes, right? So someone who controls does it right. Someone who competes likes to do things fast, right? They're first to market. They're sprinters, right? There are ways that you can innovate by having first mover status and being ahead of the field, taking an idea and running with it. The creates are the ones we think of when we think of innovators, right? They're the ones who want to do things first, right? They might not get to market first, but they have the really crazy idea, right? And collaborates, who want to do things together, who don't believe that the best ideas emerge in isolation, and they want to slow you all down, and they want to bring like John Doe on board, blah, 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 right? But there's a place for that because the best ideas frequently do come out of group thinking. So the important point here isn't that there are multiple ways to innovate, it's that if you want to build a team around innovation, which is how you build a successful product and get it to market, you need to balance out the composition of your team with different type of people. So if you're at launch point, you really don't want to create in charge, because the scope is going to creep and creep and creep. And if you're at the point where you're trying to really slow down and make sure everyone's on board, you really don't want to compete involved. So when we create teams to generate products and to think about product cycles, we make sure not only that A, B, and C, who are really smart and predisposed to entrepreneurship, are on the team, but also that the right balance of people is represented on each team. Another tool that we use, and this is more at the point of hire, although it's really important for managers to think about how people, and I should say there are diagnostics, the free diagnostics that you can look up online after this. Go to like innovatrium.org, I think it is, and you can see what type of innovator you are. But we use another diagnostic called the predictive index at the point of hire. And this allows us to figure out how people fit within roles. The really valuable thing about this tool is across 4 dimensions, we can assess, and for those of you who think psychometric testing is silly, I highly urge you to take this, because the first time I took it and they read the text description it generated for me, I was shocked, right? It was totally accurate. What this does is it measures your fit to certain positions, right? Certain positions we want to be more innovative, some we don't, right? We just need to keep the lights on in some ways, or in lots of ways. 250,000 square foot building we're in, there's lots to do. But everyone in the museum gets a predictive index at the time that they come in. So the 4 dimensions are your A, which are, there's some similarities here to the competing values framework. I'll explain the difference in a second. So your A is your competition drive. The B is your extroversion, introversion drive. The C is your patience drive, right? How much you like routine. And your D is your control drive, right? And there are things that all of these cutbacks mean, and there are particular personalities, but what's really valuable is you can assess someone's personality against the optimal personality for that job. And you can find fits and misfits. And this is a really important tool for us. It's not the only thing, we interview people, right? But it's a data point, and an important data point. Some of you are probably familiar with Herrmann Brain Dominance or Myers-Briggs. The difference between this and other tests is that those tests look at behaviors, this test looks at predispositions. This is steady state. Those of us who have less experience in the workforce, right? So I'm a younger person, we're more similar to our predictive index. You can change your behaviors, right? Those of us who are married, right, know that you can change your behaviors, right? We're very good at it. I wasn't that good, I'm divorced, right? But it happens. So the point is, right, the underlying predispositions can change. They don't necessarily manifest as the exact same behaviors, but that results in stress, right? And you end up being more unhappy in your job, it becomes more difficult, and you're more disenfranchised and more unhappy. So these are the tools we use to build teams that can develop products and deliver products in a timely way. So if we're using these tools, what products are we making? What are the entrepreneurial outputs of the museum? So hopefully, for those of you who have been following us and know what we're up to, you can think of a bunch off the top of your head. I'm going to give you 2, and I'm going to give you 2 that I think are market opportunities, right? Are revenue generating opportunities for the museum. So the first, which some of you may know about, relate to visual literacy and safety. I can go through a talk without not talking about visual literacy, right? The museum's purpose is art education, and always has been since we were founded in 1901. What we're about is teaching people about art. But generally speaking, that's not like a terribly relevant thing for you, right? Most people come to a museum, they see some art, they learn some facts about it, but then they go away and they can never implement what they've learned in the real world. How can we take what it is we're really good at museums and make it relevant and make that skill set fungible? Well, the answer we came up with is, instead of saying come to the museum and look at great works of art, we say come to the museum and learn how to see by engaging with great works of art. Because 90% of the sensory information you take in from the world, you take in with your eyes. But very few of you, I dare say none, have taken a formal course, not studio art, not art history, have taken a formal course in how to see, which is totally shocking. So what if I told you that I could teach you methods that would allow you to see more, see better, and see faster? You say, well, okay, that's interesting, or at least like think about buying that product. So the industry that's been most interested in buying that product is the environmental health and safety industry. Because it turns out if you could see more, see better, and see faster, you can spot hazards more quickly, you can investigate incidents more effectively, and your PR nightmares go away, and your workers' comp claims go way down. So we're working with local companies, but significant local companies in fee-paying capacities to develop safety programs that integrate visual literacy. Owens Corning's Global Safety Training Program integrates exercises that the Toledo Museum of Art developed through its visual literacy curriculum. We're working with ProMedica, particularly on patient safety. The Andersons is a company that is early stages yet, right, and is not quite as far up the learning curve as someone like Owens Corning, which is considered best of breed in safety, but still has incidents that they think they can make go away by working with us. So working with local major companies, but using those networks to leverage ourselves out. So for example, Owens Corning, best of breed in safety. The incidents that happen, though, they believe happen because people just aren't seeing what's right in front of them. They're not failure of process, they're not failure of procedure, they're failure of people's ability to look. So they're so interested in this that because they're highly connected to a group called the Campbell Institute, which is the internal think tank and best practices group for the National Safety Council, they invited us to give the executive session at the National Safety Council's annual conference. Pretty cool. It's like the CEO of US Steel in the room, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, right? I think the greatest compliment came from a very senior person at the State Department who came up after having a few too many drinks afterwards and said, I didn't know what to expect, but that was good shit. That's it. And Nike is interested. The Marine Corps is interested in working with us. Dow is interested in working with us because of this event. So we're using our local network of major companies and leveraging it out. So this, we think, is a really interesting growth opportunity. We think there are other markets to grow into, but there's a particular strategic reason we think safety is one worth keeping our focus on. So the other, which some of you may know about and has been discussed in various capacities, is teaching software development. So if our purpose is art education, then one of the things that you undoubtedly know that we do is we teach art classes. So show of hands, how many people are from Toledo? And how many people took classes at the museum at some point in their life? Pretty good penetration rate. We create alumni. It's one of the most interesting things about our crazy business model of being free and taking no public money. But we've taught our art classes the same way since 1901. We teach painting, we teach sculpture, right? But people generate digital art now. Artists are starting to experiment in 3D printing, right? These are skills that we should be teaching. We won't teach Java, right? We won't teach Python. We will teach artistic expression through these media. But guess what? Doing those things is actually learning those things. Now, learning those things makes you employable in the job market. And oh, guess what? High schools don't teach this, and we have scholarship funds that we can't use every year because we just have too much of them, so we can offer these classes to people who can walk to the museum. We're ringed by zip codes with low-income people for free. Seems pretty like a no-brainer, right? Given that we know that 33%, not 50%, right? 33% of TPS students don't go to college. Right? Excuse me, don't graduate from high school, right? 66% don't graduate from high school. 33% do, right? The statistics are actually a little bit misleading because they miss attrition from the point of high school into the graduation from high school. It's shocking, right? But a lot of these kids are super smart, right? And they can make a reasonable amount of money by starting doing this. And for those of you who own businesses in the tech sector, who could use the employment? All right, there we go, at least a few people. So, and those jobs are fungible. People can move. And you know what? Having people move isn't the worst thing because ultimately they'll hopefully start businesses or they'll come back after they gain experience. So we're starting to build this out. We're looking for partners to do so. But we've taken baby steps because as we build this capacity within Toledo, there are organizations that are doing similar things, although not in an art museum context. So what you see here is an entity called Game Start, which is based out of Ann Arbor. And they offered classes at the museum starting last year, and they were fully subscribed, where kids were learning to code in the context of the museum. We still have some work to do on developing joint curriculum that really fits in with the artistic expression side of the ledger, but it was a useful pilot experiment for us to learn what worked and what didn't. And of course, our objective is to work with a Toledo partner, and some of you in the room may have thoughts on that. So, I'll close really quickly by saying, all right, this is cool. Hopefully you're like more interested in the museum than you were when you came here, right? We're doing some things that you think are objectively cool, but like, what's the deal for you? You all came to something about startups. I haven't spoken about startups yet. What's the value in this to you? Well, if we go back to this slide where you think about making entrepreneurs and hiring entrepreneurs, I want you to imagine, although it's not too difficult to, that there's a virtuous cycle between these things, right? Making and hiring actually facilitates more making and more hiring because if the products are being consumed, right, then you're increasing your bandwidth to make and hire more entrepreneurs. But that's still self-serving. That's within the context of the museum. Toledo hires entrepreneurs, right? That's how that works, right? You want entrepreneurs for your business. Not people who start businesses within your business, but people who generate new products for new markets. All of you who are in business want that. And there's a virtuous cycle between those things as well, right? And we're not the only people doing this. I've already called out at least one other person who is, right? But it's the cumulative effect of these efforts. It's the thing that Gene has done, right? That Stuart and Keith have done to build this community. All of this together, that's what you call an ecosystem. That's the thing, right, that you all keep talking about, that we all keep talking about, that's missing from this community, right? But it doesn't happen overnight. It's not the CEO coming in and saying, culture change, we're entrepreneurial. It's the cumulative efforts of all these people. It's the emergent behavior of all of us, right? So the museum is doing the museum's thing in a way that is totally aligned with everything that hopefully this community in this room and beyond is trying to do. So that is it. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, let's open it up to everyone for a couple minutes. Thank you. Any questions? We can even pass the mic.
Oh, come on, guys.
I just dropped the mic. Is that good? There we go.
Back here. There we go.
CJ Anderson and Co.
CJ and that big things. There are tons of, not tons, there's several definitions of entrepreneurship. I'm really interested in how you define entrepreneurship.
Yeah. So, as I sort of alluded to in the talk, I think, right, like you can call it risk taking, you can call it starting a company, right? Ultimately, right, it doesn't go anywhere unless you have a service that people want to consume. So it's about market diagnosis and generating the thing that fills that gap. That's being an entrepreneur to me.
And put it in the context of an institution like this that basically has an endowment. How do you become entrepreneurial within an endowment, when it already has a source of capital?
Yeah, so I think part of that is, in our instance, right, the return on investment isn't necessarily financial, right? And as long as we're clear-sighted about the outcome that we're looking to achieve and we're not just rationalizing a qualitative non-financial outcome, it's a little bit easier, right? I mean, there is nothing that you can't quantify, even if it means you're like rubricing it out.
What are the
But
plans of the person you hire?
yeah, so the way we do that sort of culturally is frankly still evolving, but we have other museum employees in the room somewhere. Chris Graver, where you at? There you go. So so Chris is we're actually in the process of we have restructured the organization slightly, and this is just a tangible example. And Chris will end up being in a vertical that will report up to me, and that vertical will include information systems, communications, and education and engagement. So it'll include our programming, our educational activities, our digital and infrastructure, technology infrastructure, as well as communications, branding, and design. The point is, that's basically your audience engagement suite of departments right there. Now, a normal institution would say, we're going to fund those departments departmentally, and you are going to report up to your department head. And while it is really useful to know who's giving you your performance evaluation, the way that group will in fact function is to say, what we want to do is we want to engage audiences with products, programs, exhibitions, whatever the case may be. So that group is going to be structured by audience type. So we're in the process of doing a lot of audience research. We've done a lot of it, but we're doing a little bit more to get at motivations for visiting. We're going to segment our audience, and we're going to have teams of people dedicated to audiences. Some of them are going to be in information systems, some of them are going to be in communications, some of them are going to be in education and engagement. Some people will be on more than one team. But the teams will be composed using the two tools that I described to you before, and on the basis of their natural inclinations, right, and the diversity that exists within that team. So they will be empowered to make decisions, right, and develop products that are specific to the audience and that don't exist within the confines of the organizational structure. A lot of people confuse the org structure with the operational structure, as you well know. The operational structure will be very different than the organizational one. No worries. On the back.
Hi there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that I came to the museum the last time I was here for Rise of the Sneaker Culture. And it was fantastic. There was a party. It was dynamic. And what was really cool was to see so many different types of people who you normally wouldn't see in a museum.
Right.
And my question actually is going to be about diversity.
Yep.
We know that in American business and in the C-suite, there's a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to diversity. But unfortunately, entrepreneurial environments have replicated that.
Right.
And so, for example, it's no surprise to anyone in this room that Silicon Valley is a big protest, and that there's been issues around and community of color. So my question is, when you're looking at an entrepreneurial museum, or as those of us are thinking about the different practices, the different people that we're hiring, our mindsets, what do you recommend as far as, or what is it that you guys are doing so that that is part of the blueprint and isn't an afterthought?
Yeah, no, it's not.
Be more reflective of our community.
That's a great question. That is a great question. So there are at least two answers to that. So I'm thinking of them as I go. So the first is we have 7 design principles. Everything we do has to be about these things, right? So the first one is everything we do must be related to art, right? So some of them are really obvious. And we've added a 7th. We've added a 7th in the past 2 years, which is demonstrate diversity and inclusion. And it is about being intentional about our programming in ways that engage people where they are. So Sneakers is a great example. Sneakers was not a fine art show, right? That's not why we did it. But there's a reason we put it in the gallery we put it in. You had to walk through the galleries to get there, you had to walk through the galleries to get out, and we provided an interactive that guided you to other works of art with shoes throughout the museum. Right? So it's about taking programmatic opportunities and leveraging them to further engagement with the museum. It's a marketing funnel. Right? Now, it's a huge problem that you say audiences that are, I'm paraphrasing here, but like traditionally underrepresented or traditionally underserved, right? That's like a terrible thing. The other answer to the question, though, which is more nuanced, right, is, and we think a lot about this because we have, as far as it goes, like a pretty diverse board. Our chairwoman at the moment is one of the most significant African-American women in the world. She's the chairwoman of the board of the Girl Scouts. She's super involved in links. So she is guiding this effort at the board level through our leadership and governance committee. And she points out all the time that we're pretty sloppy about thinking about diversity superficially, right? So there is a concept that most people who've gone through diversity training will know called the diversity iceberg, right? Where the 90% is actually underneath the waterline, right? And there's so much there that we are very cognizant of, obviously, in a totally like equal opportunity way, right? But we are really careful about putting people on our teams, right? Hiring people who have different backgrounds, right? A lot of like social experience is conditioned by those superficial physical attributes, and we're cognizant of that and are actively working to diversify in those ways as well. But we think about diversity as much more multidimensional. If I asked all of you to write up your 10 top identities on pieces of paper, it's not to say that we are sufficiently diverse, but we're much more diverse than we appear. And that's a really important point to bear in mind as well, because there are ways to reach underserved audiences without necessarily having a prorated proportion of the superficial characteristics represented on your staff, right? So we do think about it in this very nuanced way, which isn't an excuse. We're moving in that direction anyway. We're being very active and intentional in our hiring structure, and it is our objective, although this is not an explicitly stated objective, it is one of our objectives that by 2020, the museum visitation and the museum staff looks more like Toledo. In an ideal world, you would be Arizona State. Arizona State's population, student population, is exactly the same in every way as the state of Arizona. The chairman there, or the chancellor, Michael Crow, he actually gave a lecture at UT in the Distinguished Lecture Series, Jessup Scott Honors College Distinguished Lecture Series. I think he was the first lecturer. He's an extraordinary guy, and they've done an amazing thing. That's the holy grail, right? But you don't get there. You don't change the culture, right? You get there over time. So I hope that mostly answers the question. How do you, like the Entrepreneurial Museum isn't about being a brofest, right? It's about getting people who think a particular way and balancing that against people who are different. So I think you had your hand up before, but we'll do both and then maybe we'll see how we're doing.
Sure, I thought it was a great presentation. I was very impressed with the visual literacy aspect and turning it into a e-producing activity. But I'm wondering what kind of parameters you put around there, what kind of a lens you look at when someone proposes a new project and determining whether it's really, appropriate for the museum.
Appropriate or viable?
Well, I mean, I presume you would want to somewhat stick with your core mission.
Yeah. Well, so if our core mission is art education, but the way that we deliver visual literacy training is to say you must come to the museum and do it in front of, because the way that you're engaging these close looking skills and developing them in ways that are portable back to the factory floor are through coming to the museum. So this is not to the point of the thing, it's to the point of the business model, right? The business model for this is Six Sigma-ifying visual literacy. So for those of you who know like Six Sigma or Lean, right? We want people to come do the course here, find a partner who will do the follow-up consulting, right? And potentially we can there's a lead gen opportunity there, right? But you make the business model consistent with the mission. You don't write something off. I think the really important thing is like, I always ask, how do you thread the needle, right? So a very different example is they wanted to do yoga in the Great Gallery. They, Circle 2445, wanted to do yoga in the gallery. And the initial response from the museum was, you can't do yoga in the Great Gallery, right? And then you ask the question, well, why not? And you come up with the reasons, the legitimate reasons why not, and you just control for those reasons, right? So you put stanchions around the artwork, and you don't allow people to bring their water in. They have to leave it in the Great Gallery, or in Libby Court where you're allowed to have water, blah, 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 right? So you say, okay, like how does it work within a museum context? Don't write it off completely. And sometimes it doesn't, right? Opening a casino wouldn't be a good idea, although Will might be able to help. But so you know, as long as it's within like a certain realm of possibility, we'll engage it. Because Y Combinator tells you this, right? Like innovation, right? And they're like very much falling victim to the create quadrant, right? But innovation lives at the intersection of this is a good idea and this is really not a good idea. So you gotta let people go there.
Now, I'd just like you to maybe speak about branding. Do you see brand?
Yeah, also, I mean, that vertical I told you about that I'm coming into responsibility for is all about brand. That's why education engagement, communications, and information systems are together, right? It's about what is the museum's brand. We're like the funniest institution you'll ever meet, right? Because we have an extraordinarily strong brand and no one can tell you what it is. Right? Are we glass? Are we free? Are we community oriented? Are we a really high quality collection? Like, what are we? Right? We don't really know, but it doesn't matter because everyone loves us, right? But that's not good enough. So I think there's a way of thinking about that, right? I don't think like General Mills worries about that, right? They worry about like, will people not know about General Mills because they love their cereal so much? It's like a problem that's been solved, right? So I feel like it's a problem that's been solved in Ohio, right? Like Procter and Gamble, right? Like in Cincinnati, right? So there are ways of managing that, but like one of the most important things is know what you don't know. Like I know it can be done, but I know that we need like some of these things to pay off to be able to afford the person who can figure that out, because I certainly can't. So, and we will not buy that expertise. We will rent that expertise because buying it is way too expensive. So if there's a last question, we can take it, or we can, or, oh God, Matt, it's going to be a tough one. All right, so we'll finish up with this.
It's just another definition of terms question.
Okay.
And it relates to your question about how you decide what to perhaps invest in. What is art? And does it have to be, you said the first principle is you're all about art.
Right.
Startup opportunities that you invest in have to be around art.
A lot you're John Dewey.
Well, so I'm gonna give a coy answer, right? So like if this is answered by that, right, then one of the worst things that has happened, you're talking to a Roman art historian, right? One of the worst things that has happened in the history of art is that the definition of art is it made by someone who calls him or herself an artist, right? It's like totally de-skilled. And there's actually a really interesting art historical reason why that's happened. But that's the answer to that question, whether or not we like it. And there are like really interesting philosophical debates you can have about it, but like that's the thing. The opportunities we would invest in are like what you would consider like classically strategics, right? So there are things that we would pay more to develop ourselves than to invest in the thing and help bring it to market. So the thing that some of you may know about is we experimented with basically an app, right? A technology for engaging with works of art, which is actually, in spite of like a large like fanfare launch or pilot test a year and a half ago already, is actually going pretty well. But that's the answer to that question: is does it need to be related to art? Yeah, probably, but could it be something which is a huge efficiency for the business? I'll give you an example of something we spoke about today, because we don't have the expertise in-house to build it, but maybe someone here does and they want to do it. There's something called the Cultural Data Project. If any of you know about it, in order to get grant funding, you have to submit all of your financial data to the Cultural Data Project, and it's an endeavor to standardize data from nonprofits so you can actually do benchmarking and figure out this is impact investing, figure out which nonprofits are worth investing in. It's a pain in the butt to input data into the cultural data project. We have to do it every year, but we're lucky because we're a big staff, so we can afford to have our grant writers spend a couple days a year doing it. An institution like the TSO doesn't have that luxury. Their FTE is 1/9 of ours. So the person who would do that is also effectively their director of development, who's got way better things to be doing, right? So if you could figure out a way to somehow automate that, understanding that like the data is probably disaggregated in a messy form, right? Then you would immediately capture for a very low fee every year, but on a recurring basis, right? Some market, right? That would probably be reasonably lucrative, right? We don't have the know-how to build that on staff, so go at it, right? But like I was talking with our CIO today about like that's the type of thing that we would do. Right, and potentially bring in a partner who would be willing to work with us to help us do it. But again, I think like the back end of the data there is too messy to make that realistic, but that's something we would use it. We would use the TurboTax for nonprofits. So like, would we build it or would we invest in someone who can make our lives easier? Sure, because we think there would be a market for it. So does that make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Just a couple quick announcements here before you guys leave. There are parking vouchers on the table here at the entryway. Grab one on your way out. The gentleman who runs the booth out here will love you forever. So that's a thing. Secondly, we gotta be out here by 9. So, which doesn't give us a lot of time to kind of mix and mingle and wrap up and get these folks home. So let's be respectful of their time too while we're here. Real quick, so we do an annual survey with Startup Toledo just to kind of, put a wet finger to the wind, if you will, and see how we're doing as an organization to make sure we're kind of meeting community needs. And as a result, if you took the survey, you were entered to win this fine book, which is really appropriate for tonight because it's called Kern and Burn, Conversations with Design Entrepreneurs. We were supposed to have given it away 2 months ago. Charlie Carr won this book, and Charlie Carr has not been here for 2 months to play his book. So guess what? Charlie Carr does not get his book. I am thinking of a number Adam is thinking of a number between 1 and 100. Can you guess what it is?
73.
74.
27. 55.
83.
48.
3.
This isn't going the way you wanted.
You heard what it's close?
42.
Someone got it backwards.
Everybody reverse your numbers.
And it wasn't
37.
37.
Hold up.